It's always a good idea as you're setting up your ACI network to make sure you're at the latest firmware levels. So let's walk through the process of what that looks like. Here we can see that for a firmware upgrade, we've got 5 different tasks that we want to do. The first thing we need to do is download the firmware from cisco.com. The second thing you'll notice as you go to download the software from cisco.com is that it actually comes in 2 different images. One is a controller software, a controller image, and the other one is a switch image. And those are the 2 images that you'll need in order to upgrade your ACI environment. From that point, we create a controller download task, which actually brings the software up to the controller in our ACI environment. Once the software is at the controller, it's going to replicate across all of the controllers in the environment, and we're going to check the firmware repository to make sure our software was successfully downloaded to the controller. After we've verified that the software is successfully on the controllers, we can then create a controller firmware upgrade task, which allows us to upgrade the software across all of our controllers. The second to last thing we're going to do is create what we call a firmware group. And the firmware group actually tells the switches in the fabric what version of firmware they should be running. So usually you only have a single firmware group for your whole network. The last thing that we do is create a maintenance group. And the maintenance groups tell us in what order we'd like to upgrade our ACI network. In most cases, you wouldn't want to upgrade all the switches at the same time because you might lose connectivity for your hosts. So it's always a best practice to create at least 2 maintenance groups. You could create the even maintenance group and an odd maintenance group, or you could divide it up, for instance, into 3 groups if that's what you wish. In our network today, we'll create 2 different maintenance groups, the even maintenance group and the odd maintenance group, to tell us that we should upgrade half the network first and then the second half when we're done, so that our hosts that are redundantly connected stay up and connected to the network. Let's go look at what this looks like on the controller. In order to get to the firmware tab, I need to first click on the admin tab and then click on the firmware tab. In my case, I've already downloaded the software to my laptop, so I'm going to go ahead and create a download task to actually send it to the repository on the controller. So I highlight the download task, I right-click on it, and I say upload the firmware to the APIC. That allows me to browse my local laptop and find the images that I'd like to upload to the controller. In this case, I have a larger image for the controller software and a smaller image for the switch software. I'm going to need to create 2 different tasks to upload each of these and get them into the repository. So here I'm going to choose the larger image, I'm going to say open, and then I'm going to say submit. And then this is going to send the software image to the controller. Now that our download task is complete, I can now go to the firmware repository and click on that to see the images that I've uploaded to the controllers. If you don't see the image right away, you may need to wait a few minutes because it takes a while for the controllers to replicate the images across each other. Once they've done that, they'll show up in the firmware repository. After I've verified that the correct images are in place, I can then go and upgrade my controller firmware. I would do that by simply right-clicking on my controller firmware and clicking on Controller Upgrade. At this point, I can pick which version of software I would like to upgrade my controllers to, and then choose whether I'd like to upgrade it now or upgrade it later. In this case, I would say Upgrade Now and Submit. In this case, I have already upgraded the software on my controllers, so I'm not going to run the job. But if I did, I would see the controllers actually copy the software out to them one by one and then reboot one by one in a rolling upgrade. So I never lose connectivity to all my controllers at the same time. Once that's completed, I can then move on to upgrade the firmware of my fabric. So I move up to the Fabric Node Firmware tab. If I expand that tab, I can see that I have the option to create a firmware group and maintenance groups. Once again, the firmware groups define what version of software should be running on a given group of devices or switches. To create a firmware group, I click on Firmware Groups I right-click on Create Firmware Group. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give this firmware group a name, which is Firmware Fabric. I'm going to pick a target version that I want the entire fabric to be running, which is 11.2.2h. And then I'm going to assign different nodes to this group. And in this case, I want to assign all of my nodes. So I'm going to put in my switch numbers 101, 102, 201 for my spines, and 202. And then I say submit. So I've now told the controller that I want all of my devices in the fabric to be set to the same firmware level. Now if I'd like to upgrade my fabric, I create maintenance groups. I highlight maintenance groups, I right-click on maintenance groups, and I say create pod maintenance group. Once again, I most likely want to create two different maintenance groups, one for my even switches, which I'm going to assign my even switch numbers, in this case 102 and 202. I'm going to go ahead and press submit, and then I'm going to create a second group for my odd switches. I'm going to name the group odd and go ahead and assign the odd devices to this group based on their number and click submit. I've now created two different groups that I'll be able to upgrade the fabric with. If I want to go ahead and run an upgrade of the switches, I right-click on the even group and I say upgrade now. I can also schedule this for a later date and time. If I was to choose upgrade now, I would then see that the upgrade progress bar would go to 0, and then as the upgrades completed on the switches, they would return to 100%. After my switches are back to normal and at 100%, I can then go ahead and run my odd maintenance group. After that, my fabric will be upgraded, and I'll be ready to go ahead and continue setting my fabric up. Please join me for the next lesson, 9.4, Understanding Checkpoints.